As I think you have seen, if you look at the program, and all of you should have now the program in the folder, the conference is divided in 4 parts. The basic idea is, first of all, we have to achieve as much as possible a consensual or partially consensual agreement on how to assess a democracy, and particularly Latin American democracy. Maybe in the first panel this morning we will not reach this achievement. We will see. But that was the first goal. The second panel is about local politics, about local government, and of course, the local level is so relevant, so important in all Latin American countries, particularly the largest one that I don't need to, I think, to add anything. The third panel is on regional integration. It is another very important aspect for the area, with Felix, with Elena, with Andreas, and Mario Telon. That is our colleague that is responsible for international relations, for LUISS will chair. Last panel, connection, basically politics and economy, consequences. You will see how Fran, Adam, Philippe will present and develop the point, and then we will listen to discuss. So this is very briefly, it is the rationale. We can look at an area from 4 different perspectives: at country level, at local level, at regional level, considering connection between politics and other dimensions. This is basically the idea. So with this, I think we can start. I invite Daniel Zovatto immediately here to chair the panel. Where is Daniel? Was a moment ago. Daniel, come here. Yes, come here, please. And then Giusy, if you like to add.
The problem is that we have 8 people.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4.
No.
And good morning and buongiorno.
So, okay,
This is the only thing that I can say in 3 languages. But I want to give a very warm welcome to this gorgeous and beautiful place. Thank you on behalf of my colleague Massimo Tomasoli and myself on International IDEA for coming here. And I want to express our deepest gratitude to our dear friend Leonardo Morlino for 3 main reasons. Number 1, for being such a great host, un gran anfitrión, querido. Number 2, for putting an excellent program in academic terms, and the presence of all of you is a testimony of this achievement. And number 3, to congratulate Leonardo for the report on la calidad de las democracias en América Latina, that all of you, either you have a written copy or you will have one very soon. This is just a preliminary draft, but we didn't want to have it printed, so you can read it and you can send your comments as quickly as possible so we can have a final draft. The program, as Leonardo was saying, is starting with the first roundtable that is about the alternative approaches to the assessment of democracy in Latin America. I'm not quite sure to what extent we are going to achieve the objective that Leonardo just said, that we will have a consensus about this issue. In the last 20 years, I went through many different seminars discussing this issue, and I never saw not even a preliminary consensus. So if we can achieve that in this first panel, it will be really a big success. If not, we will remain with the title that was Alternative Approaches to the Assessment. We have 3 paper givers. Originally, we have 4, but unfortunately, Jorge Arias excuse himself for not coming. We would like to start with Marta Lagos. I will skip the introduction because we are all good friends, and I think that we don't need to give the CV and the backgrounds of each one, but Marta is the director of Latinobarómetro. Then Michel Seligson, that is the director of the American Barometer, LAPOP, of the Vanderbilt University, will be the two paper givers, but the first one to speak will be clearly Leonardo, who is going to present the main aspects of the methodological approach of the calidad de las democracias en América Latina and the main outcomes coming out of this report. And then Marta, and then Michel. And then we have 5 discussants. We have Manuel Alcántara from the Universidad de Salamanca, Tomás Chuaki from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, Carlos Moreira de la Universidad Autónoma de Baja California, México, Simón Pachano de Flaxo, Ecuador, and Juan Rial, who is a consultant of International IDEA. And we have only 2 hours. The first thing to assess the quality of democracy is how we are going to manage time. So my original proposal is the following. Why we don't give each of the 3 paper givers 15 minutes, that will be 45 minutes, and then 10 minutes to each of the discussants. And then we will have at least half an hour, 45 minutes for a dialogue.
Anyway, you have 15 minutes more because we are
and we are 15 minutes more because we are starting 15 minutes earlier. So we have that on our benefit. So I will manage the time and 15 minutes each of you, and then we will switch the members of the table. The discussant will come, and each of them will have 10 minutes. Leonardo.
My idea is very simple. That is, as we have so many discussants and also important participants, I would like to stress 2 points, and about these 2 points, what could be the most debatable aspect. So we can develop a good discussion. My first point is when assessing a democracy, what are the problems? And then, of course, I will propose some reply, and then we will open discussion about this. When assessing Latin American democracies, what are the problems, what are the results? And again, I will propose some reply, some explanation, and then we can have the debate on this. This is my agenda in a sense. So if now I come, if now I come, for example, I think I can skip the analysis of the literature on this. Most of you know, of course, we also know that in this year, on this aspect, we had large institutions coming, working on this. We had research group, important research group. We had individual scholars. But I think I don't need, so let me skip this. And let me come to what I think I identified as the main problem of this subfield. And you see my reply. Oversimplification, especially when we only consider quantitative analysis. Think about also data that we use, such as Freedom House, other even good data, economist intelligence unit, and so on, but the problem of oversimplification is there. Approaches that are usually static, generally static, of course, because of a lack of data, usually. A key element for me, I think, ambiguous meaning of quality. What is quality? If we are speaking of the quality of democracy, what is quality? We not only have to define what is democracy, but also what is quality. And then a sort of going on mix between quality of democracy and governance, good democratic governance, governance and so on. So also on this aspect there is a lot of discussion and in some case confusion. Confusion, I think, also brought about by the fact that this is an issue that was picked by international organizations. So for international organizations, some of them cannot talk openly about democracy, they have to talk about governance. But actually, they would like to talk about democracy, so there is the root for confusion, for ambiguity. Last point that I think maybe is the most important one is explanation is forgotten. And I think this is the main, when we are doing research on this topic, I think there's still 5 problems in a sense are still partially open. Now, what are more specifically the problems that I think we should more specifically reply? And this is here my first point. When analyzing democracy today, when considering the so close link between the normative element and the empirical aspect, we have to go beyond the procedural notion of democracy. We cannot go on with the kind of paradigm that we use for years and years. We have to consider that there is a possible procedural definition, a very minimalist definition, but we have to consider also that there are normative definitions of democracy and consider them. How, you will see. The other point, what are the relevant dimensions analyzing, assessing democracy, and why are these dimensions and not others? And then, to me, still unsolved problem or very debatable problem is what are the best indicators for those dimensions. One way of analyzing democracy was through mass survey, through poll. And of course, this has been, in a sense, a main road, not only for what Marta, Mitch has been doing, but also for what, for example, I've been doing with the AmericasBarometer, even with the Eurobarometer, in Asian countries, in Southeast Asian countries. Of course, this is also a very simple road, or not a very simple road. It's a simpler road. So, is this enough? What are my problem with this? And then again, explanation. And then moving from this, can we really give a policy recommendation? This is something that Daniel stressed always very much. But can we? Are we able to give a really policy recommendation? I sometimes doubt about this. So, what is with these problems behind, with these kind of questions, more general and more specific, what I try to do? First of all, give a good theoretical definition of democratic quality, or at least give a definition of democratic quality with focus on quality. Justify why I consider some dimensions, I don't consider other dimensions. Consider, as I said, also the normative aspect, from the minimalist empirical definition to the normative aspect, and see that today a non-procedural notion of democracy is necessary. I mean, we in a situation of legitimation, of broad legitimation, widespread legitimation of democracy, people accept democracy, need democracy, if democracy is at least partially responsive. This is a key element, a key aspect. But as all of you remember, the problem of responsiveness was the point, one of the first the normative definition of democracy by Bob Dahl. So when you take into account responsiveness, you come to a normative definition. So my idea on this and my proposal more that I think is one of the most relevant aspects, if I reply in some way to my questions, I think that I developed an analytical tool that could be good for different analysis of normative notion of democracy, normative notions of democracy. It is, if, say, you have a specific, I don't know, participatory notion of democracy or liberal notion of democracy, you can look at some dimension, can look at some indicators and see how much of your normative notion of democracy is actually implemented in a country in a given moment. And then I will say something on explanation. So very quickly, the time to stay within my 15 minutes. Allow me to skip the definition. When we consider political philosophy, when we make a sort of review of political philosophy, I think that these are the main normative definition of democracy. We have to take into account this main normative democracy. Why this point is relevant? First, because when we define quality, and we define quality even in other fields, even when we define quality in marketing, even when we define quality, say, in engineering, in medicine, and so on, this is something that I stress a lot also in other occasions, you always find three notions of quality: procedure, content, and result. And when you think about procedure, content, and result, you can clearly, on one hand, go back to democracy and go back to the normative models of democracy, how much in terms of content, how much in terms of result, or even how much in terms of procedure each normative notion of democracy takes into account. But, of course, this brings us immediately to some specific quality. So there is a logic step, notion of quality, minimalist definition of democracy, normative notion of democracy, and then dimensions, relevant qualities. This is, and you will find here how, of course, the procedural aspects are relevant in the way democracy actually developed, how result is important, you come to responsiveness that I already called, how the content, the two great values of democracy can be considered, analyzed empirically, and how much they are implemented. You may notice that here I did not include another value that was a typical value in some of normative analysis of democracy: autonomy. But here, actually, then in the way how then develop freedom, I included also indirectly this aspect as I did when analyzing equality. I included indirect also the problem of solidarity. So the two main values, classic values of democracy, are freedom and equality, and then you have all other aspects. Of course, then there is and here we come to the more, in a sense, difficult problem, difficult aspect that I don't discuss here, but are relevant. How to define the dimension, as I do also in my Oxford book. How you define the sub-dimension. How you define indicators. What kind of indicators? Now, here, in terms of indicators, when I consider the quantitative data, of course, we have classic sources of quantitative data. But in this research, we added qualitative data with this 15 research group doing their report, preparing the report in the 15 countries, Latin American countries we considered, and we hope to publish the report, the transformation of report as chapter of a book in Spanish. So this will be also another result of this research. I think will be edited by Jesus Tovar and maybe by Carlos Moreira, the book on the specific country, where all specific countries are analyzed. Moving from this, you have a lot of different results, but I like, of course, the lowest quality of democracy, problem also in terms in focusing a little bit, zooming on some aspect, highest quality of democracy, as the usual suspect, Uruguay, Chile, Costa Rica, and also Brazil. You can see immediately the different profiles with this web are clear. The problem of inequality, of course, is very, very important. Also, let me skip some of this, there is no time. I think that this is maybe a key table to analyze. I say that I'm dissatisfied about this table. It's a rough way to consider a key element. And the key element is this one. If there is a working or non-working procedural democracy, we can find out this looking at how much the values of democracies, freedom and equality, are implemented. We can do this in this, as I said, rough way. So if we consider in terms of rank order on participation and competition together these 15 countries, in terms of rank order, equality, freedom, these 15 countries, you see that where there is the highest, most relevant difference are the cases, last column, are the cases where there is a problem in terms of procedural dimension, in terms of translation into implemented values of the working of democracy. And for example, you can see here immediately some problem that, for example, Chile has. Why I consider Chile? Because we said Chile is a good quality of democracy. But in terms of participation, competition, Chile is in a worse position vis-à-vis freedom and equality. And this is, in a sense, a group of countries where basically there is only Chile. The other group of relevant countries is where, for example, Brazil is better in terms of competition and participation, is worse in terms of equality freedom. That is, in Brazil, there are problems with the way the procedural democracy works in terms of translation, implementation of values in these countries. For example, of course, Guatemala is a stronger example of what I'm saying. Guatemala is the last one in terms of equality, freedom, is in the middle in terms of participation, competition. Mexico is another important case where you have is lower in participation, competition is a little bit better equality, freedom. So in a sense, belong to the Chile group of countries. So you can divide the two countries into different ways in terms of how competition and participation, the procedural aspect, are translated into equality, freedom, or in terms of maybe we could say unexpectedly you find a little bit more equality, freedom than a better working participation, competition. I take the last, I think the last point, and then explanation. Let me skip what we know about the literature. And let me stress what I think is, on this is more debatable. When we consider the different dimension when we try to avoid, and technically it's possible to do it, the problem of multicollinearity, we see that some of the dimension can explain other dimension. That is, there is a problem of internal consistency of a democracy. And so you come to this result where explanatory factors, of course, are outside democracy, are outside political institution. And you see this immediately when you look at the dimension that is more sensitive to the external aspect, that is responsiveness. But when you look to all the other dimensions that I mentioned to you, I mentioned to you early on, I would like to go back to the dimension, to remind you the dimension, the procedural dimension was competition, participation, electoral accountability, institutional accountability, rule of law. It's working. These are dimensions. Of course, you have an explanation, and this revises the result of a research we did about 10 years ago with Larry, where also Fran was involved. The result of that research, in a sense, was very Dalian. Participation and competition as the engine of the quality of democracy. That was the main result of that research. This my development is, okay, participation, competition are relevant, but actually also rule of law. Some aspect of rule of law can be important explanatory factor, what happens within freedom and equality solidarity. And then, of course, when you consider independent variable and dependent variable and you play, you also find out, in a sense, mutual convergence. What I considered, I define mutual convergence among all the dimensions. If the dimensions are worsening, then all dimensions are worsening. If the dimensions are improving, all dimensions are improving. So there is a consistency, internal consistency. And of course, this is in addition to, of course, a classic legitimate analysis where we always consider the external aspect. And I think this aspect is also relevant for the last panel. Maybe we will have time to discuss it. I stop at this point. I hope more or less I was on time. No, I can. I think, no, there are a few concluding remarks, but I think, for example, another important point, I think, about the debate of neo-populist democracy, I doubt a lot about this debate. If we define neo-populist democracy in terms of high level of participation together with low accountability and competition, we found rather democracy that are closer to hybrid regime, to ambiguous regime, rather than neo-populist democracy. That this is another story. But I stop at this point. I would like to have Marta, Mitch, and all others. I don't know.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. Excellent presentation. Marta? You have to use the computer?
Okay. Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's really, for me, a challenge to be here. A little bit, I feel a little bit restrained in front of all these huge minds I have in front of me. Not only at this table, but also in the audience. We have been involved with survey research for the last 20 years. And what I will present today is my reaction to the report, which Mr. Zovatto instructed us to do, please comment, and also my alternative view of how to measure democracy. We have been measuring democracy since 1995 in 18 countries in Latin America, and it is very hard, and I think Leonardo's effort to systematize is by far the most holistic exercise I've seen of any type of classification done in political science so far, and sociology, and political sociology for that matter. So it is hard to process the amount of dimensions you consider. But let me start with some context. I would like to go back and start with some context that helps me, I hope it also helps you, to see how I see things. So first we will, oops, okay, there. One thing that is at the beginning of the report is the private sector context, compare satisfaction with marketing. And let me show you this chart, which has nothing to do with political science. The profits of large companies help to make things better for everyone who uses their products and services. What we see, this is 1971 to 2002. This is an average for UK, but you can find the same thing for Europe. I just picked the UK. It was a clearer thing. During the 80s, we see a change, and this is at the beginning of the report. When does change take place, and what sort of change does it take place? It is within this period of time in the 80s that this changes, and all of a sudden companies are not seen as positive for societies. And there's a demand of solidarity, first value, demand of solidarity that goes with this inverse relationship of profits for companies. I think this demand for solidarity is the one that started what we call today corporate social responsibility. It all started in the North Sea with a spill of a Shell company of oil in the coasts of the Netherlands. Now, oops. Now, ever since then, you can see that in the private world, your company is not an island. And you have to consider local community, national community, and business stakeholders. This is part of the change that took place simultaneously with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this was the first world. Now, what happens in Latin America at the same time, transition takes place. Transition starts taking place 1978 till 1990. So we are exposed to this demand for solidarity that includes the state as a main actor. There's two shifts that are very important in considering what has happened in Latin America in the last 30 years. Now, let's go to another context. The satisfaction components that are also in the beginning of the report. Let me tell you what we measure at our company for people who want to look at satisfaction. First of all, the time it takes, speed of events. I must say I didn't find anything about speed in the report. What is the evolution? At what speed do things happen, and why things happen when they happen because of speed? The total cost, which is the externalities. If I have to wait too long, how much does it cost me to wait that long? And how do I react to that cost? You could put here an equal sign and put protest on the side. Brazil, for example. The cost, they got tired of waiting, the cost was too big, and they went out in the streets. Now, the importance given to you, how much inclusion, this would be the equivalent in political science, how much inclusion do you consider to be around you? The quality of the service, economic or the political good you're given, and the professionalism and knowledge of those in charge, which is the elite and the politicians. So these would be the 5 items you would look for satisfaction. And let me tell you that satisfaction is a measure of quality. So I am rather undecided when you define quality, what it is you're defining, because you can only define it by results. And you define it by results in as much as you disaggregate the elements of satisfaction. And there you see these elements, which are not necessarily all in the dimensions seen in the report. Now let's go to another dimension, context, the evolution of society's context. Well, this is Ron Engelhardt, you know, societies go from restriction to election. Sorry, I didn't translate this. From restricted conditions to elections in 2 dimensions, the self-expression and the secular rational values. Now, let us look what happened with Latin America during transition and after transition. And we can look, we can zoom in, certainly, country by country. While all the other regions of the world follow this path from restriction to more liberty, Latin America goes from 1981 to 2006. This slide is in the webpage for the World Value Survey. You can find everything there. Latin America is the only region in the world that does not follow what other societies have followed. And here's my exceptionalism point. The fact that these societies are following a different path. And we are assuming they're following a similar path. So can it be that this is it? We have 15 years of data and hardly any differences, significant differences, except for 2 countries. Hardly any significant differences in changes towards democratic norms, any of those that Leonardo just pointed out a couple of minutes ago. So one basic assumption is, are we looking at a region that will stay this way for how many generations? Is this a way of assessing democracy? I mean, are we typologizing something that is not going to evolve into a democracy? If we have imperfect democracy, why not call it not democracies? Why are we still calling them democracies something when they are not? Why haven't we developed the expressions, the tags to these situations as if they were evolving towards something else? It may well be that this takes so long a time, that's why the period of time is so important, that this is an imperfect consolidation, as Garreton says, you know, and so they shouldn't be called what they're called. And you know, the problem with political community, the existence of political community, a problem with trust, problems with solidarity. Now, okay, never mind. Now let me just go very quickly over this because this is the most well-known part of them. Now we take our data from 1995 to 2010. There's basically, that's Churchill. This is support for democracy. This question was devised by Leonardo Morlino himself. I don't know what year, but he can tell us something about 1970-something, Leonardo? No, 80. 80, okay. And this is satisfaction with democracy. Now, to say, and my last part of the presentation is measurement problem. We have measurement problems with survey research, huge measurement problems that has to do with standardization. But if we take these as if they had no measurement problems, we see two things that I'd like to point out. One is that this is the younger generation, and this is the older generation. Democracy is not producing Democrats. So evolution, again, change, is not taking place in the right direction because the younger generations are less democratic than the older generations, not only by this standard, but also by the next one. Of course, the Chilean democracy is a completely different indicator, as we will see in a minute. Age differences is not so important. But if we look at education, here is the mother of all explanations. This is the non-educated part of Latin America, which is the largest one, or the lower educated part of Latin America, okay? And so how long will it take for all generations to reach this part of education, to have a higher, this is again a value indicator. Education is a sum of values. So we have solidarity and we have values involved, which also should be taken into account when looking at measuring democracies. This is, of course, the same for the Chilean democracy. But most interesting is this, which I will do very quickly. We have here demographics, political culture, ideology, performance, and victimization as a negative performance indicator. And what we see, there is a difference between these two indicators, democracy, Churchill, and support for democracy, Morlino's indicator. Basically, the difference is this is a more value-oriented, political culture-based indicator than democracy. This one is very much performance-linked. What Juan Linz didn't want it to be, but in fact, it is. He thought there was a big difference between satisfaction with democracy and democracy is preferable, in as much as democracy is preferable was not performance-linked, but it is performance-linked, although, of course, satisfaction with democracy is much more performance-linked. So, and this is, of course, rejection of military government, which is very much linked to left-right scale. Now, we can analyze in very many ways all our data, but and what it tells us is that liberal democracy, and we have another model, you know, if you expand liberal democracy, you can start looking at, you know, this model we measure democracy against exists in some very few people. Let me stress, few people. It's not that it's not there, but the conditions under which it exists are not massive. And therefore, we're kidding ourselves by saying, okay, let's look for this democracy, this type of democracy. It's not really what the majority of people are saying. This is a value-oriented, performance evaluation of democracy, and there's very few who, in fact, assess democracy by the value of democracy. I think this definition should be stated somewhere, you know, performance or value. Is democracy per se something? Very simply, why does democracy not produce Democrats? It's because only 8% of Latin America thinks there's a full democracy. Basically, there's not necessarily democracies who are producing non-democrats. It's something else. But we can discuss that later. I just want to stress two things. There's measurement problems. The first measurement problem is contrasting survey data to objective data. This I presented in the World Bank less than a month ago. This is a self-classification of the middle class by Latinobarómetro. Look at Bolivia. 51% of Bolivianos say they are in the middle class. According to the World Bank, it's only 17%. So we have a huge measurement problem. What are we measuring here with the tag middle class, and what are people measuring here with the tag middle class? Before we do anything with the appreciation of democracy, we need to get these things on the same road, on the same floor, on the same yardstick. We're certainly measuring with different yardsticks and calling it by the same name doesn't help. Now, and I think I'll finish with this. We have another huge problem with survey research. Survey research for democratic evaluation, it's also a very young discipline. And there is no, except for maybe 3 variables, there is no standardization. Satisfaction with democracy may be the only universal question used by everybody in the same way, with the same wording in any language in any part of the world. But we have learned with the Afro-barometer and the Asian barometer and the Arab barometer that, the sky is the limit in the variations of the questions. Before we start doing very serious work in assessing democracy, the first thing we need is to standardize these, the wording. I mean, the differences here have to do with the wording, the placement of the question, the details that entail the questions. And therefore, if you take one indicator, you get one result. You take the other indicator, you get another result. And we need to be taking the same result in order to assess the quality or, the evolution of democracy. So not only the above-mentioned questions were relevant, but also the standardization or the further development of survey research. There are many, many differences. And here's a small summary, which I will not read. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marta. Great points that you want to address.
Trying to address the main paper, and I'm looking at as people code switch. We first ran into this problem in Paraguay. For those of you who know that Paraguay, Guarani, and Spanish are changed in the middle of a question, and so we can change our, in this case, we're looking from Spanish to Quechua, in fact. And finally, the data are all online with our partners in Costa Rica. You can analyze them online, and now you can download all the data for free. Each December of each even year, we release all the data for all the cases, for all questions, to all users worldwide without tracking who they are. So these are actually being, to our surprise, being downloaded a lot in China. But we don't know who's downloading them. Substantively, let me just give you the sort of the good news and the bad news of what we found with respect to this question about rule of law. What we find is that people are certainly much more optimistic about the nature of the economy. When we're dealing with the country as a whole, things have shifted in the positive direction. And similarly, when we look at the national and individual evaluations, we find the same kinds of trends. People finding things are improving in terms of the economy. But we also find in terms of inequality, the finding that the UNDP had with Lopez Calvo work, that inequality measured in our survey in terms of the distribution as the Gini index is going down, so that we find a trend that's positive in that direction. And actually that trend is nearly universal. A few countries are becoming a little more unequal, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, but virtually all the countries are declining in their income inequality. But since I'm a social scientist, let me give you the bad news and focus on that. Despite these trends, we find a very serious set of problems in terms of the application of the rule of law, the de facto rule of law, in a number of key areas. On our partnership with Princeton, we now record the skin tone of the faces of all of the respondents using this color palette. So we can get, as it were, an objective measure of the color of the respondent to see how that compares to the nature of their economic and social circumstances. What we see here, just looking at education and looking across the countries, when you go to the left, you're dealing with the lightest colors, and the right, the darkest colors. Okay. And for the countries, with the exception of Chile, Guyana, and Belize, we see this really strong trend. The darker you are, the less education you're going to have. Let me add to that another dimension. Let me add to that a gender dimension. You can see systematically that men, this is now income as our dependent variable, men are at the top, and women are substantially and consistently below them. But we have the second dimension here, that is, we have skin tone. So that at each color, we find that men systematically earning more than women. But of course, as this color gets darker, I say of course based on what you saw a moment ago, as the color gets darker, we find that the income declines. So let's go one step further. Let's look at this data in terms of your past. That is, your mother's education. How much does that matter in democratic Latin America? And it turns out it has a terrific impact. To us, I guess this was one of the most surprising findings of our work. The sociologists among our group tended to say, you got to look at people's educational backgrounds, especially in terms of the mother. We didn't track the father, since that can be more transient than the mother's education. And so examine this. When a mother has higher education, the average respondent education, the current generation, averaged out at 14. And there's not that many cases, of course, of mothers having higher education, but they're certainly there. And at the other extreme, when the mother has no education, the child, the current generation, the respondent today, has a fraction of what the children whose mothers had high education. So we're carrying with us gender, we're carrying with us color, and we're also carrying with us what we inherited. So we don't choose our parents, we don't choose our color, and we don't choose our genders, but we end up having these vast differences that affect this issue of equality before the law. This is income, same pattern. Whether it's education or income, you end up with a dramatic difference based solely upon, by dint of the circumstance of your birth. Let's now aggregate some of these things. This on the left is a light-skinned male with a mother who has higher education. And the dependent variable here is education. On the right, we have a dark-skinned female with primary education mother. These are the differences in what we can expect in terms of respondents' education. Now, I'm aggregating large groups here, darker and lighter. I'm really splitting it in the center. When we do this in terms of regression, these are simply regression coefficients graph, standardized regression coefficients graph. And we're looking at another factor, which is food security. Okay. The questions are the standard ones with our partners at Yale. In the past 3 months, because of a lack of money or other resources, did your household ever run out of food? And in the past 3 months, did some other adult in the household ever eat only once a day and go without eating all day? What predicts that? Okay. The ones that deviate from the center line are the significant coefficients. Being a female, more food insecurity. Being darker in facial tone, more insecurity. This minor one about being urban and rural. If you're in rural areas, you're more insecure. The wealthy are much more secure. And finally, the better educated are more secure. But we see gender and skin tone matter in terms of something as basic as food security in the 21st century in Latin America. And here, finally, we're going to put together now these objective factors with attitudinal factors that sustain some of these things. Let's talk about equality of rights. This is work that we published in the Americas Quarterly. The question is, and now changing the topic, thinking of homosexuals, how strongly do you approve or disapprove of such people being allowed to run for office? Basic civil liberties, okay? That is, we're not asking them to be teachers in our children and raise all kinds of issues of pedophilia and so on. We're asking whether or not a person who's gay has the right to run for office, okay? Examine these results. Okay, Uruguay, where, as you know, has been at the forefront of reform in the United States. But when you get down to this point here, Colombia, all of these other countries have minorities who would be willing to support the rights of gays running for office. I'm not even saying holding office, but their right to run for office. It suggests here that we have a preponderance of the countries in the region who support the unrule of law, who support inequality before the law, that people who are gay shouldn't have these basic civil liberties. Okay. There's some good news in that the time series evidence supports some trending in the direction of greater tolerance for the rights of gays. Lowest in 2004, these are the bars there are the confidence intervals, and there's the point estimate is the dot. And so you see that there's some increment over time, indicating a trend. Nonetheless, we're still well below the point where majorities are positively disposed towards allowing gays to have civil liberties. Here's one on same-sex couples having the right to marry. What are the factors that move the countries in the direction of greater tolerance for that issue and less tolerance? Okay. What we see here is that the people who are wealthier are more tolerant. The younger are more tolerant, females are more tolerant, better educated are more tolerant, and Catholics are more tolerant. Atheists are more tolerant. But evangelicals, people who believe that religion is very important in their lives, people who participate actively in religion, and people on the right are all less likely to be willing to support these basic civil liberties in terms of this case, same-sex couples having the right. So we see inequalities that I pointed out at the beginning, okay, undergirded by a public opinion, a predominance of public opinion, people who vote people into office. The most homophobic countries in the region are in the Caribbean. When I give lectures like this in Jamaica, I have to point out that Jamaica and Haiti are the most homophobic countries in the hemisphere, which gets a big discussion going in the Gleaner, which ends up resulting in, that's right, that's the way it should be, because gays shouldn't be running our country. Okay, that's the kind of response you get. That's the end of my presentation. You can get all this stuff by just free subscription to the Insight series, and you can get every 2 weeks these things come out. The most recent one, the one that just came out, the 100th issue, was on the issue of tolerance. That came out on Monday. Okay. Okay.
I think that now we covered the 3 presentations. We will need now the 5 discussing. You want to make a small break now, or?
No, we go ahead until 11:30. At 11:30 we have the break,
Okay.
the coffee break.
Then I will need to have a coup d'etat to move you out of here because otherwise they will not be able to come in. That's why I was gently suggesting a small break.
Yeah, but
Yes.
the idea is that the discussant come each one here.
Oh.
And then
One by one.
yeah,
Sí.
maybe
Okay.
that would
Aprobado.
if you like.
Aprobado cum laude.
Small change, Manolo, Simon. You will have to come individually, one by one, according to Leonardo. So they don't want you on a full group. So Manolo, you start. Very good. No.
Donde manda capitán no manda marinero.
I fully agree with you. You should use the beautiful Spanish language that Morlino didn't allow me to express, so that's why I'm trying. Habla en español.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Sobre América Latina, además.
Muchas gracias y gracias a Leonardo por la invitación y a IDEA. El documento, será mi primer comentario, es un documento ya conocido desde hace tiempo, por consiguiente es un documento que aporta un alto grado de madurez y de solidez. Hay un equilibrio muy notable, ¿no?, entre aproximaciones cuantitativas y aproximaciones cualitativas. Yo creo que esta es la gran novedad. Y aunque aporta un índice, yo creo que no es lo sustantivo del documento. O sea, creo que el documento tiene una riqueza que digamos que supera el tema de la propia oferta de esta medida, de esta medición, sobre lo que volveré más tarde. Y también tiene al final un muy rico postscriptum que sitúa algunos de los problemas generales de la política o de la democracia abordados por Leonardo en términos de la cotidianeidad de la política, ¿no? Una lectura muy política, si quieren con P minúscula, y haciendo uso del buscador de palabras, es curioso que no aparece un término en todo el documento como imperialismo o antiimperialismo, lo cual, digamos, viviendo el momento que algunos de los países de la región están pasando, pues es significativo. Y que el término Estados Unidos aparece exclusivamente en las primeras 12 páginas. Después, este término no aparece. Esto lo digo solo como una curiosidad. El postscriptum, que es un decálogo, comienza con un punto que me parece que es decisivo y que creo que, en mi opinión, debería guiar en parte de la discusión de esta mañana, que es el primer punto. Dice el autor del postscriptum, Juan Rial: se ha producido una evidente, una clara ruptura del consenso acerca de qué es democracia, ¿no? Si el documento, como señalaba también Daniel Zovatto, quiere ser un documento policy-oriented, de alguna manera va destinado a actores políticos que son los actores de las democracias de América Latina. Pero son actores donde se ha roto este consenso y donde, cuando se habla de democracia, se habla de cosas muy distintas, ¿no? Y en la propia, digamos, y también en la propia presentación de Marta Lagos, ella señalaba, y me he congratulado por ello, por el problema de la medición, ¿no?, que tenemos en este caso y en general en ciencia política, ¿no? Y este problema de la medición me lleva a ligarlo con el tema de democracia, ¿no? Y la existencia de series temporales que ya tenemos. Mitch hablaba series temporales en Costa Rica, desde él personalmente desde los años 70, que tienen un problema que no es fácilmente resoluble, y es el sentido del término democracia a lo largo del tiempo. El sentido de democracia para un ciudadano bonaerense en el año 84, cuando se estaba produciendo el momento dulce, el momento de luna de miel de la transición a la democracia, forzosamente no tiene nada que ver con el momento de democracia del año 91. Y lo mismo nos ocurre con, y el gráfico es muy ilustrativo, y también en el documento, el gráfico que ponía Marta, y en el documento en otro orden de cosas, cuando se pregunta, sobre de alguna manera el apoyo a la democracia, Venezuela resulta el país que tiene más altos valores. Y esto es obvio en la medida en que los dos modelos que hoy contienden en Venezuela están convencidos de que son el verdadero modelo de democracia. Entonces, claro, lógicamente, cuando se pregunta por democracia, se suman estos dos modelos y nos da una distorsión, en términos comparados con otros países de América Latina, una distorsión tremenda. Yo creo que estos son dos elementos muy claros de las series temporales que debemos repensar sobre ello. Pero siguiendo, y en términos de que el documento debe tener un propósito orientador de algún tipo de reforma política para las élites políticas, yo creo, y de nuevo voy al post-scriptum, que termina con una serie de, diríamos, con lo que plantea como recomendaciones o como cosas para pensar, el tema de las cuestiones electorales que pensamos que están totalmente resueltas en América Latina, y yo creo que no. No lo digo solo por la evidencia de las últimas elecciones en Honduras, sino por la evidencia también de la última gran reforma política en el segundo país más importante de América Latina, como es México, que vuelve a poner en cuestión el papel de lo que había venido jugando hasta ahora el IFE y se entra en una nueva discusión. Entonces, aquí hay tres elementos que Juan Real plantea y que me parece que tienen que ver mucho con una de las dimensiones que Leonardo aborda en su texto, ¿no? Que es el tema, son cuestiones electorales, vinculadas a tres cosas que no están resueltas. La primera es la financiación electoral, algo de lo que Daniel conoce muy bien, y que se registra un escenario de gran caja negra en la política latinoamericana, cada vez, digamos, en un escenario cada vez más negativo. La segunda cuestión tiene que ver con el árbitro electoral, el árbitro desde la perspectiva tanto de la organización como de la resolución de conflictos, que cada vez son más insatisfactorios. Yo creo que hay un deterioro en este sentido, claro. Y la tercera cuestión, que también se señala en este postscriptum, es la relación entre voto y nuevas tecnologías, ¿no? Tanto desde la perspectiva de las campañas, es obvio que las nuevas tecnologías permiten hacer campaña de otra manera y permiten subvertir restricciones posiblemente ridículas de no hacer campaña antes de 48 horas o 72 horas antes de las elecciones, o no dar información acerca de sondeos electorales, etcétera. Hoy las nuevas tecnologías, esto han saltado sobre ello y tienen un nuevo escenario. Y en segundo lugar, el voto y nuevas tecnologías desde la perspectiva del propio voto, del propio día electoral y la utilización de mecanismos de voto llamado voto electrónico, ¿no? Yo creo que estas son cuestiones que debemos intentar dar un paso más adelante para tener una posición, digamos, si se quiere desde la academia, si se quiere desde organismos consultores, sobre la bonanza o no de estos elementos. Y un último punto es contestar, creo que, dos preguntas que estamos en posición, Leonardo, de poderlas contestar, yo creo ya, por lo menos desde una perspectiva de todo lo que tenemos como material empírico. ¿Es una democracia de mejor calidad aquella en la que el voto es obligatorio? Segundo, ¿es una democracia de mejor calidad aquella en la que hay reelección? Yo creo que estos son dos elementos que se están discutiendo. Chile tiene una experiencia fantástica ahora mismo, precisamente a propósito de lo primero, y en México se está discutiendo, y ya está aprobado, ¿no?, el tema de la reelección, por lo menos de ciertos niveles, todavía no la reelección presidencial. Pero yo creo que esa sería una parte importante para avanzar en esta idea de suministrar, de dar insumos a la clase política para posibles reformas políticas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Manolo. Carlos Moreira.
Por 20 años del que para mí puede ser el trabajo de origen de estas discusiones, que es el texto de Guillermo O'Donnell, La democracia sobre la democracia delegativa, después seguido con las discusiones del ISPAR sobre democracia consociativa y mayoritaria. Los últimos 10 años muy intensos sobre el tema, 2004 para acá, desde el informe PNUD, entonces creo que es un buen momento para presentar un trabajo muy completo como es este. Pero es más, si leemos la contratapa del informe, este tema es un tema tan viejo casi como la ciencia política. Está un poquito chica la letra, pero lo voy a intentar leer. Dice, una de las preguntas más recurrentes de la investigación política, desde los tiempos de la República de Platón y la política de Aristóteles, ha sido ¿cuál es la mejor forma de gobierno? ¿No? Es decir, esta es una preocupación constante de los que nos dedicamos a la ciencia política, y entonces en ese contexto se inserta el trabajo. Segundo, ya desde el punto de vista teórico, creo que el trabajo tiene una virtud o fortaleza que hay que rescatar. La calidad de la democracia es un tema complejo, y para abordar los temas complejos hay que abordarlos paradójicamente complejamente. Y este estudio es el que trabaja con la mayor cantidad de dimensiones de los estudios que se hacen sobre calidad de la democracia, o que se han hecho sobre calidad de la democracia. Freedom House, el de Levin y Molina, el de la Fundación Adenauer, etc. Es decir, este esfuerzo es un esfuerzo entonces complejo para abordar un tema complejo, y eso en términos teóricos parece muy coherente. 8 dimensiones, ya las nombró Leonardo: Estado de Derecho, accountability horizontal, accountability electoral, participación política, competencia política, responsiveness, libertad, igualdad y solidaridad. 3 breves reflexiones sobre este punto. Creo, y a lo mejor Manuel se refería a eso, es que se nota quizá la ausencia del aspecto sobre yo llamaría el tema de la soberanía, es decir, el tema de la influencia de los actores externos o de actores externos sobre el funcionamiento democrático. Estamos todavía muy dentro de las fronteras nacionales. Leonardo tiene un capítulo muy interesante en su libro de Oxford sobre el papel de los actores externos e internos y la articulación entre actores. Es decir, creo que quizás habría que incorporar ese factor en el trabajo propiamente dicho de calidad de la democracia, es decir, cómo juegan los actores externos. Una segunda reflexión sobre este punto. Me voy a permitir citar a Marx. Marx decía en el método de la economía política, en la introducción de 1857, que nosotros pensamos la realidad, es decir, el pensar es una manera de reproducir la realidad por vía de la abstracción, pero nunca es la realidad misma. Es decir, la tenemos como totalidad, es una manera de trabajar que tenemos, pero es decir, ordenamos ciertamente el caos inicial del que partimos, pero tenemos que llegar a la síntesis de las múltiples determinaciones. Es decir, creo que el trabajo está en el momento para dar ese paso. Es decir, tenemos una realidad compleja, tenemos una reproducción de esa realidad complejamente también a través de muchas dimensiones, subdimensiones, cientos de indicadores, son casi 1000 indicadores, según pude contabilizar. Tenemos diferentes fuentes de información y datos. Ahora viene sería el momento del análisis más cualitativo y teórico, intentando buscar esas simples determinaciones que están detrás de lo complejo. Que sería un desafío, y creo que estamos en eso, ¿no? Y por último, la última reflexión desde este punto de vista teórico es que, lo decía Leonardo, un punto importante en este trabajo es poner en el horizonte una definición normativa de democracia. Es decir, ¿qué democracia queremos? ¿Cuál es la buena democracia? Y Leonardo identificaba 8 tipos u 8 grandes perspectivas que después se reflejan en las dimensiones. Ese es un punto importante. Alguien podría preguntarse, ¿es importante discutir definiciones normativas de democracia para medir calidad de la democracia? Bueno, yo creo que sí, que justamente esa es una de las fortalezas del trabajo. Tratar de ponernos de acuerdo no solo sobre definiciones mínimas, qué es y qué no es democracia, sino cuál es el horizonte, cuáles son las definiciones normativas, qué es una buena democracia. En las diferentes dimensiones, en las diferentes mediciones que se hacen, creo que se trabaja con diferentes definiciones normativas, y eso es lo que hace difícil la comparación entre lo que hace Freedom House o lo que hace otras instituciones o lo que hacemos nosotros. Es decir, hay ruptura del consenso en ese punto. ¿Qué se entiende por una buena democracia? Tercero, ya pasando a la parte de operacionalización. Bueno, también en este trabajo se trabaja con múltiples dimensiones y subdimensiones y cientos de indicadores, y creo que eso es una fortaleza del trabajo. ¿Por qué es una fortaleza del trabajo? Porque permite identificar para cada país cuáles son los puntos débiles con una precisión más localizada, o los puntos fuertes con una precisión más localizada. Es decir, si nosotros vemos la tabla general y decimos México es un país de calidad de la democracia intermedia, eso nos dice poco. Lo que nos dice mucho es después entrar a analizar el caso México, o sea, el caso Bolivia o el caso Argentina, en cada una de las dimensiones y subdimensiones, tratando de identificar cuáles son los puntos entonces débiles. Esto me lleva a una reflexión que voy a retomar en el último punto, en unos minutos, que es si ha llegado el momento de profundizar en estudios de casos y más aún en estudios de tipo subnacional, porque hay muchos fenómenos y muchos aspectos débiles de las democracias de nuestros países que en realidad tienen una expresión regional. Para poner un ejemplo, en el caso de la violencia en México, México es un país que no presenta tasas de homicidio especialmente graves, incluso tiene una tasa de homicidios menor que Brasil. Sin embargo, el tema en México es la regionalización de la violencia. Quizá lo que quiero decir es que esta complejización en la operacionalización es muy útil para después abordar casos nacionales, pero también y mucho más estudios subnacionales, que creo que son los que hay que hacer sobre calidad de la democracia. El punto 4, ya ahora respecto a la clasificación. Se presenta, para poner los países en 3 grandes rangos, los países de mejor calidad de la democracia. Ahí creo que casi todos los trabajos están de acuerdo, que el podio está ocupado por Chile, Uruguay y Costa Rica. En unos aparece Costa Rica, Chile, Uruguay, en otros Uruguay, Costa Rica, Chile, pero esos 3 países están siempre en el podio. El trabajo concluye de que el fenómeno de mayor calidad de la democracia es coherente o muestra una cierta coherencia con mayor calidad en libertad, igualdad y participación. Esa es una de las conclusiones del trabajo. Y allí se señala, esto lo voy a retomar al final, la paradoja boliviana, que es un caso donde la variable participación presenta un alto rendimiento y sin embargo no está asociada a los mismos niveles de rendimiento en la variable igualdad. Es decir, hay mucha participación y hay todavía importantes grados de desigualdad, lo cual parece ser una incoherencia, yo lo llamaría una paradoja respecto a esto de que mayor calidad de la democracia es mayor libertad, mayor igualdad, mayor participación. En los de abajo ya el acuerdo no es tan firme. Sí aparecen siempre por allí abajo Venezuela y Nicaragua, a veces se le suma Ecuador, a veces algún país centroamericano, puede ser Guatemala. Y allí el hallazgo es que los menores calidades de democracia aparecen asociados, correlacionados, es una correlación, con mayores niveles de desigualdad social. Y nuevamente una paradoja que es el caso de Venezuela. Venezuela es el país que mejores rendimientos ha obtenido en los últimos años en términos de reducir la desigualdad social. Creo que está allí con Uruguay con los menores índices de coeficiente de Gini. Pero sin embargo aparece en los niveles más bajos de calidad de la democracia. Habría que entonces trabajar tanto la paradoja boliviana, es un punto, o la paradoja esta venezolana de no lograr mayores calidades de la democracia a pesar de que aparentemente cumple con el requisito de niveles bastante aceptables de igualdad social. En donde yo creo que aparecen los mayores problemas son en los países intermedios. Los países intermedios, es decir, que son 8 o 9 países de América Latina, presentan grandes variaciones según las diferentes mediciones, y creo que eso nos presenta todo un desafío, que es este grupo de países que a veces aparecen algunos en el lugar 10, en otros en el lugar 4, entonces allí hay problemas. Cierro, punto 5. Tres cuestiones, entonces, resumiendo. Punto fuerte del informe. Ya la discusión no sería las democracias de calidad son las democracias institucionalizadas, democracias de baja calidad son democracias neopopulistas o basadas en un líder carismático, sino que estaríamos hablando ahora de niveles de calidad de la democracia. Ese es un punto muy interesante. Es decir, echa luz o permite un paso adelante en las discusiones que hemos tenido en los últimos años. Segundo, creo que hay una muy buena combinación en el trabajo de metodologías cuantitativas con cualitativas. Metodologías cuantitativas no es simplemente trabajar con datos, hay algunas correlaciones. Se utilizan algunos coeficientes para medir asociación entre variables ordinales, pero el fuerte del trabajo es el análisis cualitativo y creo que ese es el trabajo metodológico adecuado para abordar un objeto de estudio complejo, que es la calidad de la democracia. Es decir, profundizar en el trabajo cualitativo. El trabajo cuantitativo para temas tan complejos presenta, creo yo, limitaciones importantes. Tercero y último, y cierro. En el trabajo se resalta como un hallazgo que independientemente de la calidad de la democracia que tengan los países, enfrentan 3 desafíos o 3 obstáculos que son comunes a todos los países. Uno es el tema de la pobreza y desigualdad. Sabemos que vivimos en el continente más desigual de todos. Es decir, todos los países, desde Uruguay, de Chile, Costa Rica, hasta el último, tienen ese como gran desafío. Segundo, se señala, creo que con acierto, que el otro gran desafío de todos los países, independientemente de su nivel de calidad de la democracia, es el tema de la corrupción. Todos los países, desde Uruguay, Chile, Costa Rica, hasta el último, están atravesados por ese problema. Y tercero, el otro gran tema de nuestros días para todos los países, es el tema de la inseguridad o cómo el Estado democrático asegura vida, propiedad y libertad de los ciudadanos. Ese es un problema que está atravesando también a todos los países. A trabajar entonces creo que podría ser interesante discutir cómo profundizar en casos nacionales y en perspectivas subnacionales, pero no me refiero a perspectivas subnacionales sobre un solo país, sino comparar por ejemplo, México y Perú o México y Bolivia en alguna de las subdimensiones y en sus realidades subnacionales. Creo que eso puede aportar mucho. Otra cuestión es profundizar en algunas dimensiones en particular, tomando 2 o 3 casos nacionales para una de las dimensiones. Creo que se mencionó acá por alguno de los expositores. Y por último, tomar estas que yo llamo paradojas o inconsistencias, como la paradoja boliviana o la paradoja venezolana, también para continuar los trabajos. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Tomás Chuaki, por favor.
Yes. Good morning. I will speak in English only because my notes are in English and I don't want to add to my confusion by trying to translate simultaneously. First, thank you very much, Leonardo, for the invitation. I'm very pleased and honored to be here, though I must say I'm a bit in awe of the luminaries in the room, but I'll do my best and go right ahead. Coincidentally, I also have 5 points as the previous presenter after some brief preliminary remarks. I will focus on questions regarding the dimensions which the report chooses to analyze, and particularly I was very impressed by the attempt precisely not to oversimplify using these dimensions, and in one specific respect, which is the relationship between the dimensions. I mean, the dimensions are not simply taken one by one, but there's an attempt to relate them to one another, which I think is very, very astute and well done. What I'll try to do is to simply suggest 5 other interrelations between dimensions, which might be considered. You can see right away I'm a theorist, so this is what I feel more comfortable doing, this kind of thing. So, first possible interaction between dimensions, which is not exactly what is dealt with in the report, but which I think is implied. I was a bit surprised that the question of stability is not directly addressed in the report, not explicitly at least. It's related, of course, to the question of the rule of law, but it seems to be the case that one needs to consider stability in democratic regimes as also an aspect of their quality. And the question of stability, as I say, has to do with the rule of law, but I think it also has to do, and the Rawlsian sense of what I'm saying may be obvious to some of you, the question of stability has to do with a sort of shared conception of justice, or almost shared conception of justice over time. That is, the idea that citizens generally recognize that the resolution of conflict and disputes is reasonably fair given the circumstances, right? And I think this has to do with the rule of law, but it isn't exactly the rule of law. It has something to do with what Mitch, I think, was mentioning before about, the formal sense of rule of law and actually the subjective sense that there is a rule of law or a sense of justice being expressed in the institutions in a given country. A second point, my third point actually, it has to do with, it is in the report, there was mention of the relationship between competition and participation. I think this has to do with another central aspect of the workings of democracy, which has to do with competition and cooperation, is what I would say, rather. This is the idea that, also related to the question of stability, the idea of the willingness of citizens to cooperate. A sense of sharing a common life, a common fate, one might say, that what happens to some part of the society has to do with what happens to another part of the society. This is mentioned, I think, in the context of participation with reference to Putnam in the report. But I think it has to be more closely related with the idea of competition. It seems to me that the analysis of the quality of democracy requires one to look at how cooperation and competition interact. Democracies combine in diverse ways cooperation and competition. Electoral processes are an obvious case. I mean, they're cooperative ventures, but they're also competitive, of course. Markets are also competitive and cooperative in a certain sense. So it seems to me that one needs to try to balance these two aspects and see how competition and cooperation actually work together. Fourth point, I'm trying to be as brief as I can in my 10 minutes. This is the relationship between inequality and liberty. This is a sort of very obvious contrast, very treated in the literature. Historically speaking, there's always been this thought that there's some sort of a conflict between inequality and liberty, and what I'm going to say might seem to indicate that I actually agree with that point. I don't really, but I think we need to consider how inequality and liberty are working together. What I mean is that in the evaluation of the quality of democracy, and some of this is actually in the report, and I don't mean to say that it isn't, but I'm just trying to stress the point. in fact, in the report, there's this comparison between participation, competition, and equality, freedom, which is related to this point. But my point has to do with the idea that when thinking about the workings of democracy, I think we need to look at how what we consider to be legitimate inequalities invade, or may invade, or contaminate other areas of political life where these inequalities actually become illegitimate. There are areas in which we seem to accept actually quite large inequalities between members of the society, but we don't accept those large inequalities to invade or contaminate other areas of political life. This has to do with a fundamental aspect of equality, but it doesn't have to do exactly with formal equality of substantive equality, which is a contrast with which the report actually rightfully specifies. It has to do, it seems to me, with the prevention of the concentration of power, or the value or the worth of citizenship, the equal value of the worth of citizenship. And it is for the protection of this aspect, of the equal worth of citizenship, that great economic and social inequalities are so problematic in a democracy. They make it difficult, these differences, these inequalities make it very difficult for citizens to be equal as citizens, obviously, in the sense that it makes it more difficult for them to enjoy an equal worth of their liberties. This is also Rawlsian's talk. You know, the equal worth of liberties is affected by the great inequalities which may exist in society. So in this sense, the relationship between inequality and liberty is relevant to the analysis of the quality of a democracy. My fifth and final interaction again has to do with interaction of dimensions, again has to do with the rule of law, in this case between the liberty and the rule of law. Cicero's phrase, legum servisumus, we are slaves to the law, is cited in the report, in the section on the importance of the rule of law. But the second part of Cicero's phrase is not included, which I think is just as important. Ut liberi est possimos, in order that we may be able to be free. We are slaves of the law to enable us to be free. That's the point of Cicero's phrase. This is, of course, a very highly Republican idea. The law exists to make us free. And what this points to, I think, and which is a very significant aspect of the analysis of equality of democracy, is my view, is the idea that one cannot consider or evaluate the degree of freedom in a society simply by adding up distinct liberties. Liberties work in a system. So laws which may in a sense restrict certain aspects of our freedom, in fact may enlarge or better protect our system of liberties. Again, a very Rawlsian point. I'm sorry, I'm being very Rawlsian today. But anyhow, it seems to me that the idea of the rule of law has to be analyzed in this context, in the way in which it actually enables or better protects a system of liberties, even though any specific law may restrict any specific freedom if you take them one at a time. All of these concerns which I have mentioned, it seems to me, are in a way addressed in the report, and some of them very well. I just meant to stress and to underline some of the other combinations of the dimensions which might be useful for future analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Simon, please.
Morning, I will speak Spanish.
There's a revolution going on here.
Muchas gracias por la invitación, gracias a Leonardo, Idea. Mi comentario lo voy a hacer sobre la base del documento presentado por Idea y por Mitchell, que son los que recibí, y de alguna manera incorporó algunos aspectos del trabajo que estamos desarrollando en la red de calidad de la democracia, que estamos preparando el libro al que se refirió Leonardo en su intervención. un trabajo de estudios de casos sobre países de América Latina. Yo voy a tocar 4 puntos brevemente y de alguna manera toda mi intervención es un llamado a buscar acuerdos en algunos aspectos básicos del estudio de la calidad de la democracia. En primer lugar, yo creo que es necesario que tengamos un acuerdo sobre el concepto de democracia que utilizamos para nuestro estudio y para la medición. A pesar de que en los últimos años hay un avance hacia la identificación de un concepto o el uso de un concepto de una democracia no mínima, pero digamos de alcance medio, podríamos decir, es decir, no solamente la democracia schumpeteriana, como lo destacaba Leonardo en su presentación hoy, sino algo más que eso, con Estado de Derecho, con plena vigencia de la ley, en fin, con una serie de elementos, con accountability, con controles, con check and balances. Sin embargo, me parece que no tenemos aún un concepto compartido y que haya un acuerdo dentro del mundo académico sobre lo que estamos diciendo cuando hablamos de democracia. Creo que en este sentido es importante plantearse a la democracia como un régimen político y no como un orden social y económico. Me parece que lo social y económico debemos considerarlo sin duda como el contexto general en donde se desarrolla la democracia y como los resultados de la democracia, que son dos cosas diferentes, muy importantes, y que van a servir, digamos así, para la evaluación que hacen las personas sobre la democracia, pero no son parte constitutiva del concepto. Creo que ese es un primer elemento importante, es decir, saber que el crecimiento económico, la superación de la pobreza, la reducción de las desigualdades en el ingreso, son muy importantes, pero tienen que ver más con el desempeño de los gobiernos, si se quiere con governance, que con las características del régimen político, ¿no? Por lo tanto, creo que ahí hay un tema fundamental de definición previa para el análisis. Por lo tanto, ¿qué es de qué hablamos cuando hablamos de democracia? Bueno, obviamente de elecciones con todos los adjetivos que hay que ponerlas a estas, es decir, elecciones libres, limpias, efectivas, frecuentes, ¿no? Libertades básicas como las de expresión, de asociación, de información y obviamente separación de poderes, controles, balances, en fin. Como decía, este no es un concepto mínimo, me parece que va mucho más allá y creo que es una visión de democracia inclusiva que incluso nos permite superar ciertos debates como estos de contraponer la democracia participativa con la democracia representativa, en fin, porque creo que esto incluye a las formas de democracia participativa, sobre todo las 3 básicas que se conocen, consulta popular o referéndum y plebiscito, iniciativa legislativa y revocatoria de mandato. Además de otras que pueden incluirse como presupuestos participativos, en fin. Creo que en esto quizá debemos seguir el ejemplo de la economía, que en algún momento, yo no sé cuándo, se pusieron de acuerdo en conceptos básicos. O sea, llegar al concepto básico de Producto Interno Bruto para medir el desempeño, digamos así, de los países, los conceptos de distribución del ingreso, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Creo que hay algo hemos avanzado en este sentido, pero me parece que es aún necesario ir un poco más allá y tener ya conceptos más claros y compartidos, por lo menos en el mundo académico, que en el mundo político y en el mundo de la sociedad civil es difícil que los tengamos todavía. Los economistas han logrado algo importante en el sentido de que también en esos otros mundos se habla el mismo lenguaje que ellos, ¿no? quizá por eso tienen premio, es la única ciencia social que tiene premio Nobel, ¿no? Esperemos que algún rato la ciencia política la tenga. Segundo, creo que es necesario un concepto claro de calidad. Leonardo ha puesto mucho énfasis en eso, tanto hoy como en muchos de sus trabajos, ¿no? Pero creo que no hay acuerdo todavía en que debemos, no solamente en cuáles son los conceptos de calidad, sino en que debemos tener conceptos de calidad. Y creo que el tema importante de la calidad es que nos da los instrumentos para la medición. Es decir, creo que no es solamente un problema de saber qué estamos hablando cuando hablamos de calidad, sino que de ahí se desprenden muchos de los instrumentos de medición de la calidad de la democracia. Porque creo que aquí además hay que hacer una diferencia clara y que de alguna manera está también en el documento que presenta IDEA y Leonardo, y es la diferencia entre medir la democracia y medir la calidad de la democracia. Y si vamos a medir la calidad de la democracia, tenemos que saber qué es calidad. Y posiblemente los tres niveles o los tres elementos que presenta Leonardo posiblemente son las pistas por donde hay que entrar, pero me parece que aún necesitamos un acuerdo más claro respecto a qué es la calidad, qué entendemos por calidad y qué estamos midiendo con eso. Y me parece que en gran parte de los autores que han tratado sobre el tema de calidad de la democracia hay un descuido sobre esto. Posiblemente no es solo un problema de falta de acuerdo, sino falta de interés por definir calidad en sí mismo. Decía, me parece que la democracia o el concepto de democracia nos da la cosa que vamos a medir, el objeto que vamos a medir, pero la calidad nos da los instrumentos, nos da las herramientas con las que vamos a medir. Tercero, no tenemos un acuerdo sobre las perspectivas metodológicas, los acercamientos técnicos, ¿no? Con los cuales vamos a acercarnos a esto, ¿no? Esto puede ser una buena noticia en el sentido del pluralismo, de la confrontación académica, ¿no? Manolo se acuerda siempre de que el presidente Mao decía que 1000 escuelas florezcan y no sé cuántas flores se abran, ¿no? Entonces puede ser importante en ese sentido, pero a la vez puede crear una confusión. Necesitamos enfoques compartidos, necesitamos visiones que nos permitan saber que cuando hablamos de democracia estamos hablando de lo mismo. Me parece en este sentido muy sugerente, por ejemplo, esta nueva, para mí es nueva, no sé Marta si estaba incluida antes, esta nueva visión que ustedes han incorporado en el Latinobarómetro cuando hablan, ¿no es cierto?, de las percepciones de democracia y la democracia churchilliana, digamos, o sea, es preferible que cualquier otra, o, en fin, las otras dos, ¿no? Pero me parece que de todas maneras es necesario que tengamos una idea de qué estamos hablando o de qué está hablando la gente cuando nos habla de democracia. Y eso en el mundo académico tiene que ser algo compartido. Y por último, el cuarto punto, creo que es necesario debatir respecto a las fuentes de las cuales nosotros nos estamos alimentando para nuestro estudio. Y las fuentes me refiero no solamente a de dónde obtenemos los datos, sino, primero que nada, con qué tipo de información vamos a trabajar. Si nosotros vamos a trabajar con encuestas, vamos a trabajar con paneles de expertos, vamos a trabajar con conceptos propios que los operacionalizamos, ¿no es cierto? O vamos a trabajar con cualquier enfoque de este tipo, necesitamos justificar por qué lo estamos haciendo y por qué podemos combinar esos, que no son excluyentes. pero creo que cada uno de ellos nos está diciendo cosas diferentes. Y una cosa es que yo pregunte a la gente cómo se siente, y el caso de Venezuela, que ya ha sido puesto aquí, es muy claro en ese sentido, ¿no es cierto?, que no necesariamente refleja una situación que desde un punto de vista del concepto de democracia en el mundo académico podríamos compartir con la mayoría de la gente que dice en Venezuela que tienen una excelente democracia. Es decir, creo que ahí hay un problema muy serio en términos de digamos, el acuerdo en este aspecto. Y por otro lado, es ya la calificación de cada una de las fuentes que utilizamos. Una cosa puede ser, ¿no es cierto?, el concepto de libertad, por ejemplo, para un think tank como Freedom House o para PolitiFort, ¿no? Y otra cosa puede ser el concepto de libertad que nosotros mismos definamos en términos de un mundo académico que valora otro tipo de cosas. Es decir, ahí me parece que la calificación de las fuentes también es algo fundamental que tenemos que hacer. Bueno, decía, son 4 puntos que son un llamado más bien a la búsqueda de acuerdos, que es lo que me produce de alguna manera la lectura de estos textos y el trabajo que estamos desarrollando. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Simón. Juan.
Buenos días a todos y todas, o sea, miembros y miembros, porque tiene un inefable español. Mis comentarios van a ser lo más breves posibles, porque creo que lo importante es la discusión. Mi rol acá no es tanto el de académico, sino el de consultor representante de idea. Y como tal, lo que debo hacer énfasis es algo en lo que Leonardo no está muy de acuerdo. Leonardo dice, creo difícil poder llegar a policy, a recomendaciones de policy. Justamente, lo más importante es llegar a recomendaciones de policy. Sí, mira, lo digo además hoy hablaba con uno de los colegas, en un buen tiempo, tengo ya bastante edad, los académicos tuvimos bastante relevancia durante el proceso de transición a la democracia en los años 80, 90. Hoy lo perdimos totalmente. Y eso es un punto que creo que importa llevar adelante. Felicito a Leonardo y felicito a IDEA por lo que han hecho hasta ahora, pero se requiere ir un paso más adelante. Creo que importa mucho lo que ellos han hecho a un nivel global. Importa ahora lo que tengan que hacer en cada país. La red de estudios está tratando de hacer estos estudios, ampliando esto a país por país y a su vez a los niveles subnacionales. Pero hay que llegar más allá. Daniel y Máximo Tomasoli incluyen en la introducción la idea de que hay una nueva democracia iliberal, tomando el concepto de Zacarías. Es cierto. Y es más, si uno toma los 19 países latinoamericanos, hay uno que no se autocalifica demócrata, que es Cuba, pero es fácil calificar como democracia representativa a Venezuela, a Ecuador, a Nicaragua o a Bolivia. Es muy difícil. Es muy difícil seguir adelante con los conceptos clásicos y tradicionales. Lo que ha presentado Marta es una cosa clara. ¿Cómo puede ser que en Bolivia la gente crea que es clase media su mayoría, una autopercepción, que tú lo muestras muy bien, y en cambio los datos concretos dicen otra cosa? O que en mi país de nacimiento, en Uruguay, la gente crea que es menos clase media de lo que era antes. Hay unas contradicciones evidentes y eso no tiene solución. O sea, hay que ver cómo saltar adelante en otro tipo de conceptos e ideas. No hay que abandonar los datos cuantitativos, pero son muy difíciles. Miren, últimamente, por otras razones, trabajo en temas de seguridad. Intentaba hacer un índice de seguridad para América Central. Imposible. Los datos que provienen de los ministerios de justicia, de los ministerios de seguridad, de las policías, son todos, digamos, no solo contradictorios, falsos la mayoría. Y a partir de eso es muy difícil construir algo. Y sin embargo hay que hacer el esfuerzo. Hay que hacer el esfuerzo aunque sea cualitativo para llegar más adelante. Hoy tenemos 3 grandes crisis. Una crisis de gobernabilidad en lo que llamaríamos la fórmula política. La fórmula política hoy tiene un problema serio. hemos abandonado prácticamente la idea de la democracia con sus límites para sustituirla por la democracia de los líderes. De estos líderes que podemos llamar nuevos caudillos, de estos líderes que intentan ser presidentes de por vida, o justamente Ortega ayer ha logrado eso, y que prácticamente son poliactores o poliactrices, o sea, gente del mundo del espectáculo. Eso ya distorsiona y en mucho lo que es la calidad de la democracia que se puede vivir. ¿Cómo se puede resolver esta fórmula de la crisis política? Con consensos internos, muy difíciles de alcanzar, muy difíciles de alcanzar. Segunda gran crisis, la crisis justamente de manejo diario de la política. Alguien ya lo dijo por acá, en este momento en toda la región tenemos no solo una economía de mercado, tenemos casi una sociedad de mercado. O sea, es lo que proclamó Maduro, la necesidad de que todo el mundo tenga derecho a un televisor plasma de 40 pulgadas. Sí, eso es la democracia de mercado. Claro. Y esto se manifiesta en los saqueos de Buenos Aires. Ayer me reía en una viñeta de página 12 donde dice, qué bien que se ven los saqueos desde el televisor que me robé ayer. Bueno, y eso, claro, ese tipo de cosas está hoy llegando a absurdos. El expresidente Mel Zelaya en los otros días dijo, hubo un fraude transparente en la elección.
Lo dijo.
¿Viste? Entonces, cuando uno llega a estas cosas, uno tiene que decir, bueno, ¿cómo seguimos avanzando cuando intentamos hablar de esto? Y es evidente que esta crisis del día a día del manejo se acentúa por los problemas también de las fórmulas institucionales. El señor Maduro recurre, como lo hizo Chávez, a las leyes habilitantes, o sea, gobernar simplemente por decreto. El sueño de todo gran gobernante, simplemente poner su firma a algo que se le ocurrió, sin necesidad de que haya chequeos o balances. Obviamente esto se extiende a lo que es justicia, a lo que es el manejo de los poderes judiciales, se ha intentado toda clase de cosas, se ha intentado crear Consejo de la Magistratura y demás, pero ¿quién manipula el Consejo de la Magistratura? Y esto a su vez tiene un correlato que es el nuevo constitucionalismo. En el post-scriptum que citó bastante bien mi colega Manuel Alcántara, me he molestado en poner resúmenes de lo que son las nuevas constituciones y qué es lo que se quiere lograr con ellas. Se aleja mucho de lo que es una democracia representativa. Pero queda lo último, a su vez, la percepción, que es lo que citábamos hoy, Marta, o lo que tú tienes, Mitch. Mitch se refirió hoy a lo que son los nuevos derechos, la situación de los LTV, la situación respecto al aborto y demás, que eso parece ser el contenido de una nueva izquierda, que no queda muy claro hacia dónde va. Bueno, esto es lo que habrá que incorporar en los próximos estudios sobre calidad de la democracia o democracia. Y te entiendo, Simón, hay cosas que no se pueden discutir, pero lamentablemente tu posición es la de opositor al gobierno de Correa, y lo sabemos muy bien todos. Sí, tú. No, de ninguna manera, claro, lo sé. Entonces, es claro, hay que incorporar qué es lo que está ocurriendo en cada uno de nuestros países. Y incorporar eso implica tener en cuenta que las ideas de democracia son muy, muy distintas en cada uno de los países y qué es lo que consideran. Recuerdo perfectamente hace años cuando Adam hablaba de la democracia mínima, mínima, mínima. Y bueno, habrá que volver a la democracia mínima, mínima, mínima. Gracias.
Gracias, Juan. Okay. Thank you very much to 1, 2, 3 plus 5, 8 speakers that we accomplished within the time that we set. So we have another half an hour for a good dialogue and good interaction. 20 minutes. Why 20 minutes? We have 11:45 in the program.
No, but we have the coffee break at 11:30.
At 11:30. Okay. This is a good show how a democracy should run. Eh? Counterbalance.
This is the chair.
Eh? I am the chair, but the parliament always say no. You cannot go here. I said, why not? And he said, give me a reason. So we move. It's not a. Eh? I think that he's the real power. Yeah, but in any case, let's go into a dialogue mood, please. Speak up a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have two quick questions. The first is it the case that democracies are not producing Democrats, or is it the case that democracies are not producing people satisfied, citizens satisfied with their
Thank you very much. We are going to collect 3 or 4, and then we will give the... Please, can you identify yourself?
Mario Tella.
Okay.
LUISS, Universidad.
Good.
What I like in this conference, in this first panel, is the ability of all the speakers to combine, let me say, a empirical focus on Latin America with general questions regarding the democratic theory and democracy in general, which are also relevant for us as Europeans. I would like to address one particular question which has been defined by someone as Thomas, is the role of the external factor, Alcantara also, the weight of external factors. Even Morlino mentioned it. We have in this room so many people working on the question, the theoretical issue, how to combine comparative politics with international relations by analyzing democracy, how to combine the external and the domestic factors. Philip, Morlino, and so many others, Felix in his paper, have provided so much input on this particular issue. I think everybody agrees. Someone mentioned the United States, the role of the United States in Latin America. Everybody agrees that external factors play a role in democratic consolidation. Let's look to Mercosur for the 4 countries of Latin America, where the development of Mercosur since 91 was contextual to the democratic consolidation in the 4 countries, particularly Argentina and Brazil. I would just address a question. This interplay has to do just with the democratic consolidation at minimum level, as someone said, rightly said, or also affects the quality of democracy.
Okay.
We are in presence of multi-level factors, which is the weight of these multi-level governance on regional, global, inter-regional, Pan-American. We have a panel on the Pan-American dimension, on the evolution of domestic democratization and the quality of domestic democratization.
Thank you very much.
And what about the comparison with Europe on the same issue?
I'm afraid that in the very short time that we have is going to be very difficult to address and give answer to all the questions, but probably for the other panel, I think that could be very relevant. Please. Speak up.
My question is instigated by something that Marta said, although I'll just leave it there. Although I think it's pertinent to everything. You mentioned at some point, why do we tend to call these countries democracies when perhaps we should agree that they are something else? My question is, apart from that, should we necessarily have one vote for all these countries? Because I see the point, I see the cultural commonalities, I see this shared approaches to sovereignty and several other issues, but is it perhaps the case that we are ranking countries we assume are one group, that they are increasingly diverging from each other in terms of politics? Maybe or maybe not, I just think would like to hear your point, your feelings.
Good point. Are we okay? Okay. I think that
Well, first, the question on not producing Democrats, I'm afraid maybe I wasn't clear when I showed the data. What I showed is the evolution of 4 generations. And what you can see is that the younger ones socialized under democracy. This is a hypothesis that if you're exposed to democracy, you tend to support more democracy. Well, this is not proven. What is proven is that the more you're exposed to what we have in the region, you support less democracy. So it is a problem of if future generations are going to continue in this path, then at the end of the day, support for democracy, whichever way you measure it, I take 2 indicators, but you can take 6, you can take an index, it doesn't matter, the effect is the same. You tend to lower the support for democracy and representative liberal democracy. So in this case, this is why I'm saying democracy, or these regimes that we call democracies, are not producing And the gap there, it seems to be, well, the lack of political community, the lack of solidarity, the role of the state, the usual suspects that we know are missing or are deficient in the actual things. Now, education, we have an average education that has gone up in the last 20 years in Latin America from 6 to 7 years. Of course, there's a huge difference by country. But if you take this path and you regress it, you will find that it takes about 100 years. If you want to have today the level of support for democracy, again, with different indicators that you have for the higher education. So this is why I'm saying, the speed of change gives us the impression that we're qualifying democracy, that the hypothesis is not there, but it seems that somehow it is implied that these things are going to happen somewhat quicker than 100 years, or generational change. How many generational changes you need in order to produce Democrats. And to your question on Professor Morlino has in his book, very much cited today, this category, hybrid democracies. Again, one of the problems is that it is a static consideration. And adding, of course, to this hybrid category, the middle category, some of the comments mentioned, if you add the change, the speed of change, and the evolution of those, you might be able to distinguish whether they're diverging or not. Certainly, you can take Ecuador, Bolivia. I wouldn't take Venezuela, but I would take Ecuador and Bolivia as two examples of diverging democracies in a different sense, which muddle up the typology. So it is very easy to make a typology with one model when you have good guys on the street, which is, Chile, whatever, although Chileans would not agree with that, but for other reasons. I think that maybe I stop there.
Thank you, Marta. Mitch?
Just one comment. I think it's very important that we recognize that one item that you focused on, the satisfaction of democracy, is a fatally flawed item. The confusion of the word democracy with satisfaction with the system, whatever it is, fascism, communism, democracy, or any of the various terms we've invented, really makes the item, even though we use it in so many of our surveys, fatally flawed. So you're absolutely correct. What we can have is people who actually have higher levels of support for some of the norms. Tolerance of civil liberties, for example, it's all the way back from Dahl. It's a fairly important notion. People can have greater and greater levels of tolerance, and it may in fact go along with education. In fact, some of the trends I showed there indicate that some of that's there. While at the same time may be very dissatisfied with the performance of the regime, which happens to be democratic, however you name it. And so that doesn't mean they're dissatisfied with democracy using that item alone. When they're satisfied with the performance of the incumbent, and that should be kept clearly in mind. Thank you.
Yes. Well, I think that, when you compare, one item is the satisfaction with democracy, and the other item is the attitude towards the elements of democracy. What I'm talking here is the attitude towards the elements, which you can measure with a question that has the word democracy, or you can produce an index with questions that does not have the word democracy, and the effect is the same. So there is a distinction between performance indicators, which was your question, and these other indicators. And in that sense, I'm saying that democracy is not producing Democrats, not in the sense of evaluation of governments.
It was a genuine question.
Yes. Of course. No, it wasn't satisfaction question when I presented. There was 2. In the model, there's 5. I'm sorry, this is why I'm saying it was too quick.
But there are plenty time during the coffee for bilateral interactions. Please, Philip.
I would just like to very briefly express some skepticism about the very concept of quality of democracy. I would first congratulate everybody who spoke, because nobody really talked about the quality of democracy. You all talked about qualities of democracy. Fortunately, none of you, unlike much of the literature, tried to squash them into a single index. And that seems to me to be a very fundamental mistake. So I think I hear implicit agreement that taking these different elements and manipulating them into a single indicator and then somehow using that to compare countries is a big mistake. No, nobody did that. What the question really is, it follows off the question that was here. I mean, one thing, for example, that I've had a long discussion with Guillermo about is this famous concept of horizontal accountability. That is a personalistic characteristic. It's certainly something liberal democracy advocates, but is it an eternal product of, we all probably agree that vertical accountability is at the core to citizens, but when it comes to the design of specific institutions and the role of courts and the relationship between executive and parliament, etc., that's a very, I would say, peculiar characteristic of a subset of the democracy, who essentially, if they're not copying the United States, I mean, the prototype with the American Philadelphia Constitution, which admittedly a lot of people try to copy, but that doesn't necessarily make it a universalistic. Final comment is, one of the things that this whole discussion ignores, it seems to me that if I want to assess the quality of democracy, I must assess it relative to some understanding of the material capacity of different polities or societies to produce it. So I'm not surprised when I hear the quality of democracy in Honduras is lower than that of Sweden, for goodness sakes. I mean, that's not telling me very much. I mean, what I want to know is, holding constant the material basis of, and it's capitalism, but what I'm really talking about is holding constant the material basis. Is Honduras actually have better quality than Sweden, given the I don't think it does, but that's another matter. Given, so to speak, the social structure, property relations, and who knows what else that one might expect. So maybe Honduras, I don't know, Honduras isn't fair. Certainly Costa Rica, given, certainly historically, has done better than any European country that I know of in terms of the material basis. So nobody's mentioned that. Should we introduce this? Should we have, so to speak, a control variable for the actual material basis upon which this democratic system is rooted, in which it's rooted?
Thank you, Phil. No more? It's a very low participatory group. Massimo.
I'm Massimo Rosoli from International Media, and I have, for professional reasons, I've been exposed to a lot of policy debates, so policy makers talking about mainly issues concerning development, but of course also democratic governance, as Leonardo said in the introduction. And one thing that strikes me is that the key relevant policy message from
Leonardo.
First point, I think that most of you remember the two pieces by Galli. Galli is this famous philosopher at the end of the 50s that was discussing about contested concept. What is a contested concept? Democracy, that was one of the examples that Galli gave. Democracy is a contested concept. It is a normative concept. This is a key point. So we are not looking for an agreement. We don't have to look for an agreement. We have to allow that different people may have different views about democracy. Manolo, there has been never any break about the agreement. There was never an agreement about democracy. So what is then the point? First, we can partially agree, or we can even agree on a minimalist empirical definition of democracy, where we take away the normative aspect. Then we have to accept all the different normative notions of democracy we may have, and I made a sort of a resume of the main normative notions, because when we translate the normative notion, we have a sort of funnel. We come to some empirical dimension. That is, if we try to analyze empirically normative aspects, say participatory democracy, that is a typical important normative notion of democracy, anyone that is interested in analyzing this has to look at what kind of forms and ways of participation there is in a democracy, what kind of equality there is in a democracy. And then we also know that there are various ways of developing the notion of participatory democracy. So the point is you can have different notions of democracies, normative notion of democracy, and you have to accept this. The point is that when you translate the normative notion of democracy, you can check always through, at least in my view, these 8 dimensions, and so it's necessary that each dimension is richly measured, just to allow the fact that what I did, I developed an analytic tool for people with different notions of democracy. This is a key point. Otherwise, we misunderstand what we are doing. We are looking for the Holy Grail. There is no possible common notion of democracy. Second point, the methodological aspect is very important. On the methodological aspect, I think in these years, with King, Curin, Verba, with David Collier, with a lot of people with work, also done some of the people in this room, we made a lot of progress. So we can have shared standards in terms of measurement, in terms of how to measure and so on. Of course, you know the rule. The key rule is the transparency. That is, you clarify what you do and how do we do this. This is the way to reach not an agreement, to make transparent what we are doing. The problem of policy recommendation, practice, field of study is a typical problem. Now let's forget our field. Let's consider public policy. Even when we explain to our students public policy and we give, in a sense, the basics of public policy, we say public policy as a field of research and public policy as a field of practice. We explain what are the problems and what are the differences and what are the steps, Massimo, you were saying, and there is all of this. My skepticism, and you are right, maybe you are a more optimistic guy than me, my skepticism is that it also comes from some political experience I indirectly had, comes that making policy is really another profession. So we can say a lot of things, we can give policy recommendation, but then a politician is making another profession. So it's doing other things, to take into account a lot of other aspects. I don't think I have to go into detail when I say this. Of course, I do not deny that, and this is what actually, let's say, our fathers, I mean, Bob Dahl, Quan Linz, even earlier, Raymond Aron, did in the past. We cannot lose this. We have to, on the contrary, to go back to that point to have our kind of research to be relevant. And our research is relevant if we address relevant questions, if we do a good research, if we have good also empirical result, and then if tentatively, we very openly, we can say something more. I use this kind of expression. And then, let's say, be satisfied with this. External factors, very, very important. But Mario, here the real reply to your question is an empirical question. It's not in a sense a theoretical question. That is, the role of external factors is changing in connection with a specific country, even sometimes in connection with a specific moment. Let's think of what's happening in Ukraine. Now, Marta, you are totally right when you are considering, you added all the context, the aspect of context. It's very important. I don't have the time to comment. Thank you. And I would like to thank you all for the comments, because I will include a lot of these comments in the final draft of my report. Thank you very much.